I had always imagined retirement would be peaceful. For years, I pictured myself sitting on a quiet porch with a cup of tea, listening to birds instead of traffic, and watching sunsets instead of staring at office walls. I spent more than 35 years working as a librarian in a busy California town. My life had been simple, predictable, and comfortable, maybe even too comfortable. When my husband passed away 5 years earlier, everything changed. The house we had shared suddenly felt enormous. Every room echoed with memories that refused to become quieter with time. Friends suggested traveling, joining clubs, or moving closer to family, but none of those ideas felt right. I wanted something different, not excitement, not adventure. Just a place where I could begin again without constantly looking over my shoulder at the past. That was how I found the old Victorian house. It sat on the edge of a small coastal town, hidden behind ancient oak trees and climbing roses that had grown wild over the years. Most people ignored it because it looked abandoned. The paint had faded, several windows needed replacing, and the garden looked more like a tiny forest. The realtor apologized for its condition almost every 5 minutes. I smiled every single time, because while everyone else saw years of neglect, I saw possibility. The house wasn't expensive. In fact, many buyers had walked away after seeing it. Some thought it required too much work. Others believed it felt strange. I wasn't superstitious. Old houses always carried stories. That was part of their charm. Within a month, the papers were signed. My furniture arrived, and I officially became the owner of a home that had been standing for almost 100 years. The first weeks were busy. Boxes covered every room. Dust seemed to appear no matter how much I cleaned. Every cabinet contained forgotten objects left behind by previous owners, rusty keys, broken clocks, faded postcards, buttons, old recipes written on yellow paper. Each discovery made me wonder about the people who had lived there before me. Sometimes I imagined mothers preparing dinner, children running down the hallway, grandparents sitting near the fireplace during winter evenings. A house remembers everyone who has ever loved it. At least, that's what I liked to believe. One rainy afternoon, I decided to remove the old wallpaper from the upstairs bedroom. The wallpaper had tiny blue flowers that were probably beautiful decades earlier. But now it peeled away in long brittle strips. Removing it was slow work. Hour after hour, I scraped carefully, revealing the original wooden walls underneath. Then my scraper hit something solid. At first, I thought it was just another nail. But the sound felt different. Hollow. Curious, I pressed my hand against the wall. One section moved ever so slightly. My heart began beating faster. I found a screwdriver and carefully loosened the wooden panel. It came away much easier than expected. Behind it was a narrow compartment hidden inside the wall. For a moment, I simply stared. Dust floated through the sunlight. The compartment wasn't large. Inside rested only a small wooden box covered in faded green fabric. There were no locks. No markings. No names. I carried it downstairs and placed it gently on the kitchen table. Some part of me wondered whether I should leave it untouched. Maybe it belonged to someone's family. Maybe someone would eventually come looking for it. But another part of me reminded myself that the compartment had been sealed inside the wall for decades. If no one had searched by now, perhaps no one ever would. I slowly lifted the lid. Inside lay dozens of neatly stacked envelopes tied together with a pale blue ribbon. The ribbon almost crumbled when I touched it. The envelopes were surprisingly well preserved, every one of them had been carefully addressed. But something immediately caught my attention. None of them had ever been mailed. There were no stamps. No postal marks. Only elegant handwriting across each envelope. The first simply read, "For Eleanor." Nothing else. No last name. No address. Just those two words. I hesitated. Reading another person's private letters felt wrong. I almost closed the box again. Almost. Instead, I unfolded the first letter with trembling hands. The handwriting inside was graceful. Steady. Beautiful. The writer began with a sentence I have never forgotten. If you are reading this, then life has already surprised you more than once. I frowned. It sounded unusual. Almost as though the writer expected someone else, not Eleanor, to find the letters someday. I continued reading. The first pages weren't romantic. They weren't dramatic. Instead, they spoke gently about loneliness. About growing older, about learning that silence can become both your greatest comfort and your greatest fear. Every sentence felt strangely personal. As though someone had quietly watched my own life unfold. I finished the first letter in complete silence, then I reached for the second, and then the third. Ours disappeared, outside. Rain tapped softly against the windows while daylight slowly faded into evening. I barely noticed the letters became impossible to stop reading. Each one described ordinary moments, walking through gardens. Watching the ocean during winter, drinking tea alone on quiet mornings, missing people who could never return. None of it seemed impossible. Yet every page somehow echoed parts of my own life. Coincidences happen. I told myself that several times. Older people often experience similar emotions. There was nothing mysterious about that. Nothing supernatural, nothing impossible. Then I opened the seventh letter. Halfway down the page, I froze. The words blurred before my eyes. I read the same paragraph again, then a third time, because the writer described an old Victorian house near the coast, a hidden compartment inside an upstairs wall, and a woman who had moved there after losing her husband. Exactly as I had. My hands began to shake. The room suddenly felt much quieter than before. I slowly looked around my kitchen. The house hadn't changed. The rain still fell outside. Everything remained perfectly ordinary. Except the letters resting on my table. And for the first time since buying the house, I wondered if they had been waiting for me all along. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the elegant handwriting from the letters. I kept telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Perhaps the woman who had hidden them had simply experienced a life that resembled mine. Grief is universal. Loneliness is universal. Maybe I was only seeing connections because I wanted them to exist. By morning, I almost convinced myself of that. I made coffee, opened every curtain in the house, and tried to focus on ordinary things. I watered the flowers I had planted near the front porch. I unpacked another box from the dining room. I even turned on the radio to fill the silence. None of it helped. The wooden box remained on the kitchen table, quietly waiting. Eventually, I gave in. I untied the faded ribbon once more and picked up the next envelope. The date written inside caught my attention immediately. It was 42 years old. The paper had yellowed with time, but the ink remained perfectly clear. The letter began by describing the same house. The writer mentioned the old oak trees, the squeaky staircase, and even the cracked window in the upstairs hallway that I had planned to replace. Those details couldn't have been guessed. Whoever wrote these letters had truly lived here. Then came another sentence that made my stomach tighten. The writer spoke of a woman who would someday discover the hidden compartment while removing blue floral wallpaper from the upstairs bedroom. That was exactly what I had done. No one knew about that except me. Not even my daughter. I stopped reading and walked through every room of the house. I checked the doors, the windows, the attic. The basement. I knew how irrational I must have looked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was inside the house. Of course, no one was there, only old wooden floors that creaked beneath my feet and the distant sound of waves rolling toward the shore. When I returned to the kitchen, I continued reading. The writer never claimed to predict the future. Instead, she described it as if she had spent years imagining the life of the person who would someday Live in her home, she wrote that, "Houses choose people just as often as people choose houses." It sounded poetic, yet somehow comforting, over the next several days. Reading the letters became part of my routine every morning. I promised myself I would stop after one, every evening. I realized I had spent hours reading 5 or 6. The letters were arranged in chronological order. As I progressed, I learned more about Eleanor. She had never married. She loved gardening. She painted landscapes that no one ever bought. She believed every stranger carried an invisible story. Her words were thoughtful, without being dramatic. She never complained, even when describing difficult years. Instead, she always found something beautiful to notice: a bird building a nest, fresh bread from the bakery, the smell of rain on old wood. She noticed everything. One afternoon, I decided to visit the town library. If Eleanor had really lived there, perhaps someone had records of the house or its previous owners. The building was much smaller than the library where I had worked for decades, but it felt warm and welcoming. An elderly volunteer greeted me with a kind smile. I asked whether they had old property records. She pointed me toward a shelf filled with local history books. For nearly 3 hours, I searched through faded newspapers, photographs, and handwritten archives. Eventually, I found the address. The house had changed owners several times, but one name appeared more often than the others: Eleanor Whitmore. She had lived there for 36 years, according to an old newspaper article. She had been an artist who rarely exhibited her paintings but donated many of them anonymously to local charities. There was only one photograph, a small black and white image no larger than my palm. I stared at it for a long time. She looked peaceful, not smiling broadly, just quietly content. Something about her eyes felt familiar. Not because I had seen her before, but because she looked exactly as I imagined someone who wrote those letters would look before leaving the library. I asked the volunteer if anyone still remembered Eleanor. The woman thought for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. "Only one person," she said. She explained that Eleanor had been close friends with an elderly carpenter named Thomas Reed, who still lived outside town. He was now well into his 90s. Very few people visited him anymore. The next afternoon, I drove to the address she had given me. His cottage stood beside a small lake surrounded by pine trees. It was modest, but beautifully maintained. Flower boxes decorated every window. Someone clearly still cared about the place. Thomas answered the door himself. His hair was completely white, and he leaned on a polished wooden cane. When I introduced myself and mentioned Eleanor's name, his expression changed instantly. Not with fear, with sadness. He invited me inside without asking another question. His living room smelled of cedar wood and old books. For a while, we simply talked about the weather, the town, and retirement. Finally, I gathered enough courage to ask about the letters. Thomas became unusually quiet. He looked toward the fireplace before speaking. He admitted that Eleanor had written letters almost every week during the last years of her life, not because she expected anyone to answer them. She simply believed that writing helped preserve thoughts that might otherwise disappear forever. I asked whether she had ever mentioned hiding them inside the house. He slowly shook his head. "No," he said softly, "but that sounds exactly like something she would do." Then he smiled. For the first time, he told me Eleanor often joked that one day another lonely woman would buy the old house, someone who needed hope more than advice, someone who would understand her words better than anyone alive at the time. I felt chills run through me. Did she know who that woman would be? I asked. Thomas answered without hesitation. No, she only believes that every house eventually finds the person who needs it most. Before I left, Thomas disappeared into another room. A few minutes later, He returned carrying a wrapped canvas. He carefully removed the cloth. It was a painting. The old Victorian house stood beneath a golden sunset. The oak trees looked almost identical to the ones outside my window. There was one detail, however, that stole my breath. A woman stood on the front porch. Her face wasn't detailed enough to identify, but she wore the same light blue sweater I had been wearing the day I found the hidden compartment. The painting had been completed more than 40 years ago. I stared at it, unable to speak. Thomas noticed my expression. He quietly admitted something that left me completely speechless. I never understood why Eleanor painted that woman, he said. She told me she hadn't met her yet. I drove home with the painting resting carefully on the back seat of my car. The entire journey felt unreal. I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting the image on the canvas to change every time I looked away. Of course, it never did. The woman remained standing on the porch beneath the golden evening sky, her face softened by the artist's brushstrokes and impossible to recognize with certainty. Still, something inside me had changed. For the first time since my husband died, I wasn't thinking about the emptiness I had carried for years. I was thinking about Eleanor. Who had she really been? How could she have imagined someone so similar to me decades before I arrived? Was it intuition, coincidence, or simply the wisdom of someone who understood people better than most? That evening, I placed the painting above the fireplace. It looked as though it had always belonged there. The house felt different. Not haunted, not mysterious. Just a complete. After dinner, I returned to the wooden box. Only a handful of letters remained. I opened the next one carefully. The handwriting seemed slightly less steady than before, as though Eleanor's hands had grown weaker with age. She wrote about time. She said people often believed they left houses behind when they moved away, but in truth, every home quietly carried pieces of those who had lived within its walls. A laugh, a tear, a celebration, a goodbye. Nothing truly disappeared. It simply became part of the house itself. I read slowly, allowing every sentence to settle in my mind. Near the end of the letter, Eleanor wrote something that stopped me once. Again, she apologized. Not for hiding the letters, but for asking a favor of the stranger who would someday find them. My heart raced as I unfolded the final page. She explained that she had never had children. Most of her closest friends had passed away before her. She feared that when she died, every memory of the people she loved would disappear with her. That frightened her more than death itself. So she had written everything down. Not to preserve her own story, but to preserve theirs. She asked only one thing: if the future reader believed those forgotten lives still mattered, would she tell someone else about them? Would she allow ordinary people to be remembered one last time? I wiped away tears before I even realized they had begun falling. The request was so simple, yet somehow it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. The final envelope rested alone inside the box, and like the others, it had never been sealed. Across the front, in the same elegant handwriting, were only 4 words: for whoever finds me. I took a deep breath, then I opened it. The final letter was shorter than all the others. It began with gratitude. Eleanor thanked the unknown reader for giving her words a second life. She admitted she had never expected anyone to actually discover the hidden compartment, but hope, she wrote, was always worth leaving behind. Then came the final paragraph: if you have reached this page, you have probably spent many years believing that your best memories are behind you. I once believed the same thing. I was wrong. Life has a quiet habit of surprising us after we stop expecting miracles. Open your curtains every morning. Plant flowers even if no one will see them. Smile at strangers. Keep learning. Keep wondering. One ordinary day, your life will become someone else's favorite story. I lowered the letter and looked around the room. The evening sunlight poured through the windows. For weeks, I had thought this house was giving me a fresh start. Now I realized it had given me something far greater. Purpose. The next morning, I visited the local historical society. I donated copies of Eleanor's letters so they would never disappear again. The originals remained with me, safely stored in the same wooden box where I had found them. Thomas smiled when I told him what I had done. He simply nodded and said Eleanor would have liked that. Over the following months, my life slowly changed, not because of magic, not because of prophecy, because the letters reminded me that every ordinary person carries a remarkable story if someone is willing to listen. I began volunteering at the library. I helped organize local history events. I interviewed elderly residents and recorded their memories before they were lost forever. Some had lived through wars, some had built businesses from nothing, others had spent decades quietly helping neighbors without expecting recognition. Each story mattered. Each voice deserves to be remembered. One autumn afternoon, almost a year after moving into the house, I decided to open the hidden compartment again. I wasn't looking for anything. I simply wanted to make sure it remained dry and protected. As I reached inside, my fingers brushed against something I had somehow missed before. A tiny folded piece of paper had slipped into a narrow crack behind one of the wooden beams. I unfolded it carefully. There were only 2 sentences. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor. I knew you would look again. Now it's your turn to leave something behind. I smiled for a long time that evening. I sat at the same kitchen table where I had first opened the wooden box. I took out a blank sheet of paper. Then another and another. I began writing. Not because I expected someone to find my words decades from now. Not because I believed in fate, but because I finally understood what Eleanor had been trying to teach me. Stories outlive us. Kindness outlives us. Hope outlives us. Years passed. The garden outside flourished again. The roses climbed higher than ever. Neighbors became friends. Children who walked past the house often waved from the sidewalk. Sometimes I imagined Eleanor smiling somewhere beyond time, pleased that laughter had returned to the old home she once loved. Whenever visitors admired the painting above my fireplace, they always asked the same question: who is the woman standing on the porch? I always smiled before answering. I think she's whoever needs this house the most. Perhaps one day someone else will remove old wallpaper from an upstairs bedroom. Perhaps they will discover a wooden compartment hidden inside the wall. Perhaps they will find my letters resting beside Eleanor's, if that day ever comes. I hope they understand what took me so many years to learn. A home is built from wood and stone, but a life is built from the stories we choose to leave behind. And sometimes the greatest gift we can give a complete stranger is the reminder that no ordinary life is ever truly ordinary.